My wife called me dead weight in front of our entire family. The room went completely silent, and while I sat there humiliated, realizing that 40 years of sacrifice meant absolutely nothing to the woman I loved. I quietly left the table with nowhere to turn, feeling like a relic in my own home. Then, at exactly 10 at night, her lawyer called my private phone by mistake, and he revealed a secret that changed everything. Before I tell you how I dismantled their perfect lives, let me know what city you are listening from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you believe respect is earned, not bought. I am Ronald, and I am 70 years old. For the last 4 decades, my life was defined by the smell of diesel fuel, cold mornings, and endless hours. I built a supply chain logistics company from the ground up. It started with one single broken-down delivery truck that I bought used. Back then, Diane and I were just a young couple scraping by, but I made her a promise. I promised I would give her a life where she never had to look at a price tag. I kept that promise. I worked 80-hour weeks. I missed my son Aaron's Little League games and my daughter Nicole's piano recitals. I was the ghost who paid the bills, the invisible engine that funded the sprawling 6-bedroom house in the Connecticut suburbs, the private school tuitions, and the expensive country club memberships. A year ago, I finally sold the company. I thought it was time to rest. I thought it was time for Diane and me to finally enjoy the quiet retirement we had always talked about. But retirement was not the peaceful reward I had imagined. Without the company demanding my constant attention, I was suddenly present in the house all day, and I quickly realized that I did not belong in the world Diane had built for herself. My presence was an intrusion. Over the years of lifting heavy crates and ignoring minor injuries so I could keep working, I developed a severe limp in my right leg. My knee is stiff, and some days it aches down to the bone. To me, that limp is a badge of honor, proof of the hard labor that built our wealth. To Diane, it is an embarrassment. She has spent the last year hosting lavish afternoon luncheons and elegant dinner parties, constantly filling our home with neighbors and members of her social circle. She dresses in designer clothes and pours expensive wine holding court in the living room, while I sit quietly in my leather chair in the study. She subtly excludes me from conversations, interrupting me if I try to speak, or completely changing the subject when I enter a room. I convinced myself that she was just adjusting to having me home. I made excuses for her coldness because I loved her. I loved my children too. Aaron, who is now 42, grew up to be a mid-level corporate manager. He wears expensive suits and always talks about his big investments, though I always suspected he lived beyond his means. Nicole, at 35, plays the role of the sweet, caring daughter, but her affection usually precedes a request for a financial favor. Last Friday night, we hosted a celebratory dinner. Aaron and his wife Rachel had just purchased a massive, unexplainably expensive new house. It was a sprawling estate that I knew Aaron's corporate salary could not comfortably cover. But tonight was about celebrating his success. Diane had hired private caterers. The dining room table was set with our finest crystal and imported linens. I was seated at the far end of the table, feeling more like a spectator than the patriarch of the family. Aaron sat near Diane, boasting about the square footage of his new property and the custom renovations they were planning. Rachel, who has never hidden her deep materialism, spent the first 20 minutes showing off a heavy diamond tennis bracelet she claimed was an early anniversary gift. Nicole was there with her husband, Colin. Colin is a man who loves the sound of his own voice, and he spent the evening nodding along to Aaron's boasting, trying to inject his own exaggerated successes into the conversation. I sat quietly eating my meal and trying to find a moment to participate. I finally saw an opening when Aaron mentioned the logistics of moving his furniture. I smiled, leaning forward, and offered to call a few favors from my old trucking contacts to help him out for free. The table went uncomfortably quiet. Aaron exchanged a look with Rachel, a quick, dismissive roll of the eyes. Diane let out a sharp sigh and immediately asked Colin about his recent golf game, entirely erasing my offer from the air. I felt a flush of heat in my cheeks, the familiar sting of being sidelined in my own home. I decided to just reach for my wine glass to busy my hands. But my right leg, stiff from sitting too long in the rigid dining chair, cramped violently. I tried to shift my weight to accommodate the sudden spasm, but my knee gave out. My elbow bumped the edge of the table. My hand knocked directly into the crystal wine glass. It shattered against the imported hardwood floor with a sharp, violent crash. Dark red wine splashed across the pristine white baseboards and pooled on the expensive rug. For a second, I just froze the sharp pain in my leg, momentarily forgotten in the wake of the mess. I immediately began to apologize, pushing my chair back to grab a napkin. I expected someone to ask if I was cut. I expected Aaron to hand me a towel or Nicole to ask if my leg was bothering me again. Instead, Diane stood up. Her chair scraped loudly against the floor. She did not look at the broken glass. She looked directly at me, her eyes filled with a cold, unvarnished disgust that took my breath away. She did not whisper. She did not try to save my pride. She spoke loudly and clearly, ensuring every single person at the table heard her. "You are just dead weight, Ronald. You are dragging down what are supposed to be my golden years. I cannot even host a simple family dinner without you ruining it. You are clumsy, you are old, and you are embarrassing me." The words hit me like a physical blow to the chest. The air in the dining room vanished. I stopped moving, my hand still hovering over the spilled wine. I looked up at the woman I had provided for since she was 22 years old. There was no regret on her face, only pure resentment. I turned my gaze to my children, desperately hoping one of them would intervene. I looked at Aaron. I had worked 80-hour weeks to put through an Ivy League college. I was looking down at his plate, a faint, unmistakable smirk playing on his lips. I looked at Rachel, who simply rolled her eyes and took a sip of her water. I looked at Nicole, my little girl. She was carefully adjusting her napkin, staring blankly at the wall, completely ignoring my humiliation. Colin checked his expensive watch, looking bored. The silence was absolute. It was the silence of total complicity. No one defended me. No one told Diane she had gone too far. In that suffocating quiet, the truth became crystal clear. They did not see a father or a husband. They saw an ATM that had finally stopped dispensing cash. They saw a useless relic who was taking up space in their perfect, polished lives. A profound, icy calm washed over me. I did not yell. I did not defend myself or demand their respect. I realized in that moment that respect from these people was not something I wanted anymore. I slowly stood up, ignoring the shooting pain in my bad leg. I placed my napkin on the table, straightening my posture until I was looking down at all of them. I did not say a single word. I turned my back on the lavish dinner, the spilled wine, and the family that had just discarded me. I walked out of the dining room, my uneven footsteps echoing in the quiet hallway. I went straight to my study and closed the heavy oak door behind me, leaving them to their celebration. I sat in the dark for hours, letting the reality of my life sink in. I was entirely alone, but I had no idea just how deep their betrayal truly went. The heavy oak door of my study clicked shut, piling me away from the laughter and the clinking crystal of the dining room. The silence in the room was absolute, a stark contrast to the lively celebration happening just down the hall. I sank into my worn leather chair and let the darkness wash over me. The only source of light was the faint amber glow of the street lamp filtering through the thick curtains. My right leg throbbed with a dull and persistent ache, a physical reminder of the decades of brutal labor I had endured to build a life for my family. I rubbed my stiff knee and stared at the shadows on the wall. The words my wife had spoken just moments ago echoed endlessly in my mind. Dead weight. She had called me dead weight in front of my own children, and they had simply smiled. I looked down at my hands. They were calloused and scarred from years of gripping steering wheels, lifting frozen crates, and repairing broken engines in the freezing rain. I had built a multi-million-dollar logistics empire from nothing. I had given Diane a life of absolute luxury, shielding her from every hardship. And now that I had finally sold the company to enjoy my retirement, I was nothing more than an embarrassing burden to them. The antique grandfather clock in the corner ticked methodically, marking the slow passage of time. I felt a profound and suffocating emptiness settling in my chest. The sorrow was so heavy that it made it difficult to breathe. I wondered where I had gone wrong. I wondered how the family I loved so deeply had become a group of strangers who despised my very existence. I closed my eyes, preparing to spend the rest of the night alone in the dark, trying to figure out how I would survive the rest of my life in a house where I was no longer wanted. Then, at exactly 10 o'clock at night, the silence was shattered. My private cell phone began to vibrate violently against the polished wood of my desk. The sudden buzzing startled me. I opened my eyes and looked at the bright screen illuminating the dark room. It was an unfamiliar local number. I frowned, feeling a sudden wave of confusion. Very few people possessed this private number. It was a secure line I only used for top-tier corporate clients and urgent family matters. Diane knew the number, but she rarely ever used it. Assuming it might be an emergency regarding a former employee or a late-night logistical issue from the new owners of my company, I reached out and answered the call. I brought the phone to my ear, but before I could even say a word, a man began speaking rapidly. His voice was sharp, arrogant, and dripping with a smooth corporate confidence. "Diane, it is Campbell," the man said. "Do not speak, just listen to me. I know it is late, but I wanted to call your secondary line to give you the final update before the weekend begins." My breath caught in my throat. My heart slammed against my ribs with terrifying force. I froze completely, pressing the phone tighter against my ear. I did not make a single sound. Campbell did not wait for a response. He was completely and utterly convinced he was leaving a confidential message for my wife. "The asset concealment is complete." Campbell continued, his tone filled with a smug sense of victory. "I am leaving the office now, but I wanted to confirm that we successfully routed the final wire transfers through Aaron this afternoon. The dummy corporation did its job perfectly. The blind trust is fully funded and sitting safely in the offshore accounts, just as we planned. Your husband is completely blind to it. We have erased the paper trail, and Ronald has absolutely no idea what is coming." A wave of ice-cold nausea washed over me. The room began to spin. I gripped the armrest of my chair so tightly that my knuckles turned white. I could not believe what I was hearing, but the lawyer was not finished. "You played your part perfectly at the dinner party tonight," Campbell said, letting out a low chuckle. "Keep him distracted and feeling isolated through the weekend. It is all done, Diane. I have the finalized divorce filings sitting right here on my desk. We will submit them to the judge first thing Monday morning. By the time Ronald is served his morning coffee, his primary accounts will be frozen, and he will be legally boxed out of his own estate. Enjoy your evening. You have earned it. I will see you in court." The line went dead. A hollow dial tone echoed in my ear, ringing like a funeral bell. I slowly lowered the phone and placed it back onto the desk. My hand was shaking so violently that the device rattled against the wood. The silence in the study returned, but it was no longer a peaceful or sorrowful silence. It was the silence of a house built on a foundation of absolute treachery. My mind raced at 1,000 miles a minute, desperately trying to process the sheer magnitude of the words I had just heard. Campbell. Asset concealment. Aaron. The blind trust. Divorce papers on Monday. It was not just a cruel comment at dinner. It was not just a wife losing her affection for her aging husband. It was a calculated, malicious, and highly coordinated conspiracy to completely destroy my life. And my own son was helping her do it. I leaned back in my leather chair and stared up at the dark ceiling. The physical pain in my leg completely vanished, replaced by a sudden rush of cold, pure adrenaline. Everything started to make terrible, devastating sense. Diane hosting those lavish dinner parties and inviting her wealthy friends over constantly was not just about her social status. It was a deliberate distraction. It was a meticulously crafted smokescreen designed to keep me feeling isolated, inadequate, and out of place while she worked behind my back with her lawyers. She wanted me to feel so small and insignificant that I would not bother to look closely at our joint finances and Aaron, my golden boy. My son purchasing that massive multi-million-dollar estate last month had confused me. I had wondered how a mid-level corporate manager could suddenly afford a property of that magnitude. Now I knew the horrifying truth. I was buying that sprawling mansion with my money. My own flesh and blood, the son whose Ivy League tuition I had paid for with years of my sweat and labor, was managing a blind trust to launder the wealth I had spent 40 years building. Nicole and Rachel had to be in on it too. Their smirks at the dinner table were not just signs of disrespect. They were expressions of triumph. They had been sitting at that dining table tonight, drinking my expensive wine and eating the food I paid for, knowing full well that on Monday morning I would be thrown out onto the street with nothing to my name. The humiliation I had felt earlier during the dinner party evaporated. It was instantly replaced by a deep, burning rage. This was not a family disagreement. This was financial murder. They wanted me to be a broken, destitute old man, stripped of my dignity and my life savings. But they made one catastrophic mistake. They drastically underestimated me. They looked at my gray hair, my pronounced limp, and my quiet demeanor, and they saw a weak, tired old man who would simply roll over and accept his tragic fate. They forgot who I really was. They forgot that I built a massive empire in a cutthroat, unforgiving industry by outsmarting and outmaneuvering people who were far more dangerous than a greedy wife and a spoiled, arrogant son. I survived ruthless corporate raiders, economic crashes, and vicious competitors. Tracking stolen money was just another logistics problem, and logistics was the one thing I understood better than anyone else in the world. I took a deep, slow breath, forcing the air into my lungs. The panic and the heartbreak began to recede, burning away, until nothing was left but ash and iron. In their place, a cold, terrifying, and absolute clarity took over my mind. I looked at the digital clock on my desk. It was exactly 10:15 on a Friday night. Campbell had explicitly stated that the divorce papers and the asset freezing orders would be filed on Monday morning. That meant I had roughly 58 hours to completely dismantle their conspiracy. I had 58 hours to secure my life's work before they locked me out of my own accounts and finalized their theft. I did not storm out of the study. I did not walk down the hall to scream at Diane or demand a tearful explanation from Aaron. Confronting them right now would be the foolish, predictable reaction of an emotional and defeated man. It would give them the warning they needed to accelerate their timeline and move the offshore money completely out of my reach. I needed to be smarter than them. I needed to be absolutely perfectly silent. I would not show a single crack in my demeanor. I would play the part of the tired, frail, defeated old man all weekend long. I would give them exactly the pathetic victim they expected to see. I opened the heavy bottom drawer of my desk and pulled out my private encrypted laptop. I had always allowed Diane to handle the day-to-day household finances because I trusted her completely with my life. That trust was now dead and buried. I booted up the computer and opened a secure browser, my fingers flying across the keyboard with a speed and precision I had not used since I ran my company. I needed to see the damage. I needed to track the digital footprints of their betrayal and find the exact path they had used to siphon my wealth. If Campbell, Diane, and Aaron truly thought the asset concealment was complete and untraceable, they were about to learn a very painful lesson. They were about to discover that I knew every single trick in the corporate playbook. I was no longer the discarded husband or the dead-weight father they laughed at during dinner. I was a man fighting for his survival, and I was going to find every single dollar they had stolen. When I was finished with them, they would be the ones left with absolutely nothing. I placed the phone back on the polished mahogany desk. I did not slam the receiver down. I did not throw the device against the wall or sweep my arm across the desk to shatter the lamps and picture frames. I set the phone down with the gentle, meticulous precision of a man handling a live explosive. The screen went dark, and the study was swallowed once again by the heavy, suffocating silence of a Friday night. Outside my window, a gentle breeze rustled the large oak trees I had planted with my own hands 30 years ago. Inside the room, my entire universe had just been vaporized into dust. 40 years. 40 years of marriage, of shared beds, of whispered secrets in the dark, of building a life brick by brick. I sat perfectly still in my leather chair, staring blankly at the shadows, stretching across the floor, waiting for the tears to come. I expected a blinding wave of grief to wash over me. I expected to weep for the woman I had loved since we were kids, scraping by on cheap diner coffee and grand dreams. I braced myself for the crushing weight of a broken heart, but my eyes remained completely dry. The grief never arrived. Instead, an agonizing, freezing clarity settled over my skin, chilling me down to the marrow of my bones. The woman I had vowed to protect, the woman I had broken my back and sacrificed my youth to provide for, was sitting just down the hallway. She was casually sipping expensive wine with the children we had raised together, celebrating my impending execution. She was smiling, laughing, and playing the perfect hostess, all while knowing she was going to leave me absolutely penniless on Monday morning. I closed my eyes and pictured her face. Diane. The way she had glared at me across the dining table just an hour ago, masking her ruthless contempt with polite societal grace. It was terrifying how easily she wore the mask. I wondered exactly when the shift had happened. When did the woman who used to pack my lunches for my long-hauling shifts turn into a corporate assassin? Was it when I finally sold the logistics company? Was it when the massive buyout deposit hit our joint accounts, blinding her with a level of liquid wealth she had only ever seen in movies? Or had this poison been festering inside her for decades, masked by the comfortable, luxurious life I kept throwing at her feet? It did not matter anymore. The why was entirely irrelevant. The what was all that mattered now. They had routed wire transfers. They had set up a blind trust. They were going to serve me with asset-freezing orders the second the courthouse opened. If I walked out of this study right now, if I marched down that hallway, kicked open the dining room doors and screamed at her in front of Aaron and Nicole, I would lose everything. That is exactly what a desperate, emotional man would do. A betrayed husband would storm into the room, demand answers, flip the table, and beg for an explanation. He would show his hand out of pure, unadulterated hurt. And the second I showed my hand, Diane would smile, retreat into her victim persona, and call Campbell. Her smug lawyer would panic, accelerate their timeline, and move the offshore money deeper into the digital shadows where I could never, ever reach it. Silence. Silence had always been my greatest weapon in the boardroom, and now it would be my ultimate shield in my own home. In the cutthroat world of supply chain logistics, the man who speaks first loses the negotiation. The man who loses his temper surrenders his leverage. I had spent 40 years sitting across the table from ruthless corporate raiders, vicious competitors, and arrogant executives who thought they could bully me out of my margins. I beat them all by simply sitting back, watching them talk, and letting them expose their own weaknesses. I would do the exact same thing to my wife. Let them think I was a defeated, clueless old man nursing a bad leg. Let Aaron smirk into his expensive wine glass and pretend he was a self-made titan of industry. Let Nicole ignore me while she spent the allowance I provided. Let Diane believe she had completely outsmarted the tired, aging workhorse who had carried her through life. I would not give them the satisfaction of a confrontation. I would not shed a single tear in front of them or beg for the dignity I had earned. The absolute best way to destroy an arrogant opponent is to let them believe they have already won the war. They thought they had backed me into a corner and disarmed me, but they forgot that a cornered animal is the most dangerous thing in the room. I stood up from my chair. The stiff ache in my right knee flared up instantly, a sharp, biting reminder of the physical toll my life had taken. But I welcomed the pain tonight. It grounded me in reality. It reminded me that I was a survivor, a man built from grit and endurance. I walked over to the heavy study door and quietly turned the brass lock. A soft, definitive click echoed in the quiet room. That tiny sound was the official end of my marriage. From this exact second forward, I was a ghost haunting my own house. I was a man operating entirely behind enemy lines. I turned back to face the room and began to systematically prepare my workspace. My mind forcefully stripped away the emotional titles of wife, son, and daughter. I could no longer afford to view them as family. They were hostile actors. They were corporate thieves attempting to stage a hostile takeover of my life and my legacy. To survive this weekend, I had to uncover exactly what assets Diane had hidden, where she had buried them, and who helped her turn the soil. All without triggering a single alarm. Campbell had mentioned wire transfers, a dummy corporation, and an offshore blind trust. That meant paper trails existed. No matter how clever a divorce lawyer thought he was moving, massive amounts of capital always left footprints in the digital sand. I just had to dig deep enough to find them before Monday morning. But I had to be absolutely flawless in my execution. One wrong login, one triggered fraud alert on a joint bank account, or one misplaced password attempt, and Diane would receive an automated email notification directly to her phone. I had to audit 40 years of shared financial history like a phantom in the night. I walked over to the towering mahogany bookshelf lining the far wall of the study. I reached up and carefully moved a heavy stack of old leather-bound supply chain manuals I had kept for sentimental value. Hidden behind them, bolted directly into the reinforced wall framing, was a small biometric steel safe. Diane did not even know it existed. She had never cared enough to look through my old work materials. Inside that safe was my private corporate laptop, a heavily encrypted machine I used exclusively for highly classified government contracts and top-tier logistics routing before I sold the business. I pressed my thumb against the glowing green scanner. The heavy steel door popped open with a quiet hiss. I reached inside and pulled out the laptop, feeling the cold metal of the casing beneath my fingertips. This study was no longer a place of quiet retirement. It was my war room. As I carried the machine back to my desk, the crushing gravity of the weekend ahead settled firmly onto my shoulders. Every conversation I had with Diane tomorrow, every cup of morning coffee we shared in the kitchen, every fake smile I offered when she asked how I slept would be a high-stakes performance. I would have to sit across from the woman who was actively trying to destroy me, and I would have to smile back with the vacant, docile expression of a man waiting for the end of his life. I would have to swallow my disgust and play the fool perfectly. I sat back down in my leather chair, opened the laptop, and pressed the power button. The screen flickered to life, casting a pale, cold blue light across my face in the dark study. The low hum of the processor sounded like a warning drum. My family thought I was a broken old man who had outlived his usefulness. They were about to learn what happens when you try to steal from a man who built an empire from the dirt. The hunt had begun. The secure browser loaded instantly. I navigated to the private banking portal that held our primary joint accounts. These were the accounts where the bulk of the cash from the sale of my logistics company had been parked while I consulted with wealth managers on long-term investments. I typed in my credentials, bypassed the two-factor authentication on my private phone, and pressed the Enter key. The loading icon spun for 2 agonizing seconds. When the dashboard finally materialized on the screen, the numbers staring back at me made my stomach drop into a bottomless pit. The primary savings account was bleeding to death. Just a week ago, that specific account held over $6 million in highly liquid capital. Tonight, the bold black numbers on the top right corner of the screen read a meager $85,000. I blinked, leaning closer to the glowing monitor, thinking my tired eyes were playing tricks on me, but the numbers did not change. Over $5 million had simply vanished into thin air. I clicked on the transaction history tab, my pulse thrumming a slow, angry rhythm in my ears. I filtered the ledger for the last 30 days, and the entire architecture of my wife's betrayal laid itself bare across the screen. Starting exactly 3 weeks ago, massive outgoing wire transfers had been executed every Tuesday and Thursday afternoon. $250,000, $500,000, $1 million. Each transaction was meticulously categorized under vague labels like asset reallocation, wealth management, restructuring, and private equity funding. They were all authorized using Diane's digital signature. She had been draining my life savings right from under my nose, likely clicking the approval buttons on her phone while sitting in the living room drinking tea with her friends. I pulled up the destination routing numbers for the largest wire transfers. In the logistics business, you learn very quickly that money never actually disappears. It just changes vehicles. I opened a secondary window and accessed a corporate database tool I used to use to vet overseas shipping contractors. I ran the routing numbers and traced the receiving accounts. The money was not going to another traditional bank. It was flowing directly into an offshore holding company registered in the Cayman Islands. It was a classic blind trust, a financial black hole designed to make assets completely invisible to the United States legal system. But a blind trust requires a managing director to establish the domestic bridge account. Someone had to physically set up the routing architecture here in the States before the money could be pushed overseas. I dug deeper into the domestic receiving bank's public filing history. I bypassed the redacted names and pulled the original registration certificates for the holding company. When the domestic authorization signature finally loaded on my screen, all the air left my lungs. The managing director of the dummy corporation was not Campbell. It was not some anonymous offshore banker. The signature belonged to Aaron. I stared at my son's name printed on the digital document, my own flesh and blood. The boy I had taught to ride a bicycle. The boy whose first car I bought. The boy I had bankrolled through a prestigious university so he would never have to break his back unloading freight trucks in the snow like I did. He was the architect of the theft. He had used his corporate finance background to build the exact digital pipeline his mother needed to steal my retirement. I remembered the lavish dinner party happening down the hall. I remembered Aaron bragging about his sprawling new estate and the expensive custom renovations he was planning. A sickening wave of realization washed over me. Aaron did not get a promotion. Aaron was not a brilliant investor. Aaron was funding his extravagant new life with the money he was actively laundering for his mother. They were splitting the spoils of my execution. I looked away from the laptop and stared at the dark wall of the study. The sheer scale of the deception was breathtaking. This was not a sudden crime of passion or a spontaneous decision to file for divorce. This took months of careful, calculated planning. Diane and Aaron had sat at my dining table for months, eating my food and smiling at my face, all while meticulously plotting to leave me with absolutely nothing. I turned my attention to the digital clock on the bottom corner of my computer screen. It was 11:30 at night on a Friday. Campbell had been explicitly clear on the accidental phone call. The asset concealment was complete, and the divorce filings were sitting on his desk. He was going to submit them to the judge first thing Monday morning. I mentally mapped out the legal timeline. The moment a judge signed that preliminary divorce petition, a mandatory asset freeze would immediately lock down all of my remaining domestic accounts. I would not be able to transfer a single dime, hire a proper legal team, or access the funds I needed to fight back. By 9 o'clock on Monday morning, the trap would spring shut. I would wake up a completely destitute man, legally barred from my own money, while my stolen millions sat safely in Aaron's offshore trust. I had exactly 60 hours before the courthouse doors opened. 60 hours to completely reverse and engineer a theft that took them months to build. I closed the banking portal and wiped the search history from my browser. I could not let Diane see a single trace of panic or suspicion this weekend. I had to continue playing the role of the useless, hobbling old man they all believed me to be. But the time for passive observation was over. I needed my own weapon. I needed a man who understood the dark, ruthless underbelly of corporate finance better than Aaron or Campbell ever could. I picked up my secure phone and pulled up my contacts. I scrolled past the family numbers I now knew were enemies. I stopped at a name I had not called since the day I finalized the sale of my company. Mr. Russo. He was a vicious, discreet, and terrifyingly brilliant wealth management lawyer who had protected my corporate assets from ruthless competitors for over 20 years. It was the middle of the night, but I knew Russo never truly slept. I pressed the call button and listened to the line ring, ready to bring my empire back from the dead. The line rang exactly 2 times before the call connected. Russo never slept. In the 20 years he had served as the chief legal counsel for my logistics company, he operated like a machine that ran purely on black coffee and corporate warfare. He was a predator in a tailored suit, and he was the only man I trusted with my life. When he answered the phone, he did not bother with pleasantries or ask why I was calling him at midnight on a Friday. He simply stated my name and waited. I did not waste his time with my broken heart or the humiliation I had suffered at the dinner table. I gave him the cold and brutal facts. I told him about the accidental phone call from my wife's divorce lawyer. I told him about the millions of dollars that had been siphoned out of my primary savings accounts over the past 3 weeks. I read him the routing numbers I had managed to scrape from the domestic receiving bank. Russo went completely silent for a moment. The only sound on the line was the rapid, aggressive clicking of his mechanical keyboard. When he finally spoke, his voice was completely devoid of empathy, and that was exactly what I needed. He told me to grant him remote access to my encrypted laptop. He said we were going to tear the digital walls of their blind trust down to the studs. For the next 3 hours, I sat in the dark of my study watching my computer screen as Russo deployed forensic accounting software that cost more than most people earn in a lifetime. It was a masterclass in digital excavation. I watched as he bypassed the dummy corporations my son Aaron had set up. The money had not traveled in a straight line. It had been fractured into dozens of smaller wire transfers bouncing through shell companies registered in Delaware and Nevada before being bundled back together and pushed across the ocean. The sheer complexity of the financial architecture was staggering. It proved that this was not a sudden decision made by an angry wife. This operation required months of meticulous planning and a deep understanding of corporate money laundering. The digital trail eventually led us exactly where I suspected it would. The funds had crossed international borders and settled into a private banking institution located in the Cayman Islands. It was a fortress of financial secrecy designed specifically to hide massive amounts of wealth from the United States government and from betrayed spouses. Russo explained that a blind trust is a ghost in the legal system. It separates the legal ownership of the assets from the person who actually benefits from them, making it nearly impossible for a domestic judge to freeze the capital during a standard divorce proceeding. Diane and her lawyer had built an invisible vault and locked my retirement inside it. But Russo was not a standard divorce lawyer. He was a corporate shark who spent his entire career protecting billion-dollar supply chains from international embezzlement. He told me that a blind trust is only blind to the public. To the international regulatory bodies and the banking compliance officers, there is always a master ledger. Someone had to sign the original incorporation documents. Someone had to be listed as the authorized managing director to release the funds when the divorce was finalized. Russo initiated a backdoor inquiry through a contact he kept on retainer in the overseas banking sector. The waiting felt like an eternity. The antique clock in my study ticked past 3 in the morning. My coffee had gone completely cold. My stiff leg ached with a deep, punishing throb, but I refused to move from my chair. I stared at the flashing cursor on my screen, knowing that the next document Russo pulled from the International Registry would reveal the true architects of my destruction. When the encrypted file finally decoded and materialized on my monitor, the air completely vanished from my lungs. Russo had pulled the original registration certificates for the offshore holding company. I leaned closer to the glowing screen, reading the fine print of the legal documentation. I expected to see Aaron's name. I had already traced his digital signature to the domestic bridge accounts earlier that night. I knew my son was the financial engineer behind his mother's grand theft. But when my eyes reached the bottom of the final page, my heart stopped beating. There were 2 authorized managing directors listed on the offshore account. They were designated as equal partners with full legal authority to liquidate the stolen millions the second the divorce was finalized. The first signature belonged to Aaron. The second signature belonged to Nicole. I stared at my daughter's name printed clearly in black ink on the digital document. Nicole. My little girl. The daughter who used to fall asleep on my chest when I came home exhausted from the shipping yards. The daughter who had walked into the study just a few hours ago carrying a piece of cake from the dinner party, smiling at me with those wide, innocent eyes. She had kissed my cheek and told me to get some rest while the rest of the family celebrated Aaron's new house. She was the co-signer of the offshore trust. A suffocating wave of nausea washed over me. I gripped the edge of my desk, trying to anchor myself to reality. It was one thing to accept that my wife of 40 years had grown to despise me. It was another thing to realize my ambitious, greedy son had decided to steal my wealth. But Nicole played the role of the peacemaker. She was the one who always told me how much she appreciated my hard work. She was the one who constantly asked me for small financial favors to help support her husband, Colin, and his failing business ventures. I had paid off their credit cards. I had funded their luxury vacations because she told me she was overwhelmed and needed a break. Now looking at her signature on a document designed to leave me completely destitute, I realized every single request for money was a calculated test. She was probing my accounts, checking my liquidity, and reporting my financial vulnerabilities directly back to her mother and brother. She was not a sweet, struggling daughter. She was a fully complicit partner in a criminal syndicate that operated under the guise of my family. Russo's voice cut through the silence of the room. He read the names aloud, confirming the nightmare I was staring at. He told me the structure of the trust was designed so that Diane never actually touched the money herself. If Diane never held the capital, the divorce court could not accuse her of hiding assets. Aaron and Nicole were holding the stolen millions in their own names, keeping the wealth perfectly insulated from the marital estate. Once the judge finalized the divorce and left me with nothing, the children would simply distribute the laundered funds back to their mother through corporate dividends. It was a masterpiece of financial betrayal. They had weaponized my own children against me. Or rather, my children had eagerly volunteered to hold the knife. I thought back to the dinner party. I remembered the absolute silence in the dining room when Diane called me dead weight. I remembered looking at Aaron, who had smirked into his wine glass. I remembered looking at Nicole, who had carefully wiped her mouth with a napkin and stared blankly at the wall, completely ignoring my public execution. Their silence was not shock. It was anticipation. They were sitting at my table drinking my wine, knowing that in just 2 days, they were going to be millionaires at my direct expense. The deep, profound sorrow that had been threatening to break me all night instantly evaporated. The betrayal was so absolute and so perfectly cruel that it burned away any remaining shred of paternal mercy I had left in my soul. I was no longer a father looking at his children. I was a man looking at a pack of scavengers who were trying to pick the flesh from my bones while I was still breathing. I picked up the phone. My voice was no longer trembling. It was as cold and hard as concrete. I told Russo to lock down the copies of the offshore registries. I told him I wanted every single transaction, every forged signature, and every digital fingerprint meticulously documented and prepared for a federal judge. Russo asked me what my parameters were. He asked me if I wanted to negotiate a quiet settlement to keep my children out of a criminal courtroom. He warned me that exposing a conspiracy of this magnitude would carry devastating legal consequences for Aaron and Nicole. They would lose their careers, their homes, and potentially their freedom. I looked at the digital clock on my desk. It was now 4 a.m. In less than 48 hours, my wife would file the paperwork to erase my existence. My family had shown me absolutely no mercy when they planned to leave an old, crippled man to die in poverty. I was going to return the favor with absolute, ruthless precision. I told Russo there would be no negotiations. I told him there would be no quiet settlements and no mercy for anyone involved. I instructed him to prepare the heaviest legal artillery he possessed. They wanted to steal my empire. Now they were going to learn why I was the man who built it in the first place. The digital clock on my desk shifted to 5 in the morning. The sky outside the study window began to turn a pale and bruised shade of gray. Russo and I had been working in absolute silence for hours. We had mapped the entire offshore network that Aaron and Nicole were managing. But as Russo continued to pull the banking ledgers from the Cayman accounts, a new and glaring inconsistency appeared on the screen. The numbers simply did not make any sense. I stared at the total balance of the blind trust. I knew exactly how much money Diane had siphoned from our domestic savings over the past 3 weeks. She had taken slightly over $5 million. But the total balance sitting in the offshore holding company was vastly larger. The digital ledger showed a staggering $13 million sitting safely in the Caribbean bank. I leaned closer to the monitor, rubbing my exhausted eyes. I asked Russo where the additional $8 million had come from. I told him it was impossible. I knew my exact net worth. I knew every penny I had earned, saved, and invested over 40 years. Diane could not have stolen $8 million from our personal accounts, because that money never existed in our personal accounts. Russo did not answer immediately. The sound of his mechanical keyboard echoed through the phone speaker. He told me he was running a secondary audit on the initial deposit dates. He said the blind trust had not been opened 3 weeks ago when Diane began draining our joint savings. The offshore account had been established 14 months ago. 14 months ago. The timing struck me with the force of a physical blow. 14 months ago was exactly when I began the process of selling my logistics company. I sat back in my leather chair. My mind drifted back to the final days of my career. Building that supply chain empire had broken my body. I had spent decades breathing in exhaust fumes and sleeping on warehouse floors to make sure shipments arrived on time. When my bad leg finally made it impossible to walk the loading docks, I knew it was time to step away. I wanted to sell the company to a larger corporate conglomerate. I wanted to make sure my employees were taken care of and that I could finally rest. But I was a man of warehouses and freight lines. I was not a man of modern corporate mergers. When I announced my decision to sell, Aaron had immediately stepped up. He told me he wanted to handle the negotiations. He wore his expensive tailored suits and spoke with all the corporate jargon he had learned at his Ivy League university. He told me the market was tough. He told me the big conglomerates were undervaluing independent logistics firms. I trusted him completely. He was my son. I felt an overwhelming sense of pride watching him sit at the negotiation table representing the empire I had built. After 3 months of meetings, Aaron came to my study. He handed me the final valuation documents. He looked me directly in the eyes and told me he had fought tooth and nail for the best possible deal. He said the buyers were willing to pay $4 million for the entire company. It was lower than I had initially hoped, but Aaron convinced me it was a massive victory in a cooling market. I signed the paperwork. I took the $4 million, and I retired thinking my son had protected my legacy. Russo's voice broke through my memories, bringing me back to the cold reality of the dark study. He told me he had just accessed the public acquisition filings from the corporate conglomerate that purchased my company. Because the purchasing firm was a publicly traded entity, they were legally required to report all major acquisitions to the Securities and Exchange Commission. Russo pulled their quarterly earnings report from last year and bypassed the redacted trade names to find the exact financial footprint of the buyout. He sent the document directly to my encrypted laptop. The file opened on my screen. I read the acquisition summary, and the air completely vanished from my lungs. The purchasing conglomerate did not buy my life's work for $4 million. The official filing listed the final acquisition price of my logistics company at exactly $12 million. I stared at the number printed in stark black ink. $12 million. The room began to spin. A cold and suffocating numbness spread through my chest. I asked Russo to explain what I was looking at. I asked him how a publicly traded conglomerate could report a $12 million purchase when the contract I signed clearly stated $4 million. Russo explained the mechanics of the betrayal with the clinical detachment of a forensic surgeon. He told me that Aaron had not just acted as a broker. Aaron had created a digital ghost. During the negotiation process, Aaron secretly established an intermediary shell corporation. He structured the buyout so that the purchasing conglomerate technically bought the shell corporation. They wired the full $12 million directly into Aaron's intermediary account. Once the conglomerate paid the $12 million, Aaron forged a secondary set of valuation documents. He drafted a completely fake purchase agreement and presented it to me in my study. I had looked at my son and signed a worthless piece of paper. Aaron then wired $4 million from his shell corporation into my personal retirement account. I thought I was receiving the full payment for my life's work. In reality, I was being handed a pacifier. The remaining $8 million never even touched American soil. Aaron and Diane immediately laundered the stolen $8 million through a labyrinth of international routing numbers, dumping it straight into the Cayman Islands Blind Trust. They had robbed me of $8 million before the ink on my retirement papers was even dry. The sheer scale of the financial violence was almost impossible to comprehend. I sat in the dim light of my study, trembling with a rage so profound it felt like poison in my veins. The betrayal I discovered earlier tonight was devastating, but it was a domestic dispute. A greedy wife draining a joint bank account was a tragic but common story. What Aaron had done was entirely different. Aaron had committed massive, coordinated federal wire fraud. He had engaged in corporate espionage, money laundering, and grand larceny. He had used the education I paid for to systematically dismantle my legacy and steal my empire. I remembered the day the sale was finalized. Diane had hosted a lavish dinner to celebrate my retirement. Aaron had stood up at this very dining table and raised a glass of expensive champagne. He made a speech about how proud he was of his old man. He looked me in the eyes, smiled, and toasted to my hard-earned rest. He did all of that knowing he had just stolen $8 million from me. He smiled at my face while picking my pocket. He handed me $4 million and kept $8 million for himself and his mother. The $4 million they allowed me to keep was never meant to sustain my retirement. It was just a temporary holding fund. They let me keep it in the joint savings account so I would feel secure and docile. They knew the entire time that the moment Diane filed for divorce, they would drain that $4 million right back out. They wanted it all, every single penny I had ever earned. I closed my eyes and let the truth wash over me. The pain of the betrayal burned away the last lingering shadows of paternal affection I held for my son. Aaron was not a misguided child trying to please a greedy mother. Aaron was a ruthless white-collar criminal. He was a predator who saw his own father as nothing more than a profitable acquisition target. He had evaluated my trust, measured my blind spots, and executed a flawless corporate heist against his own family. Russo told me we had a critical decision to make. He explained that uncovering the wire fraud fundamentally changed the nature of our retaliation. We were no longer preparing for a messy divorce hearing in a local family court. We were now staring at a massive federal crime. Russo told me that if we handed these documents over to the authorities, the Federal Bureau of Investigation would become involved. Aaron would face decades in a federal penitentiary for wire fraud and embezzlement. Diane would be charged as a primary co-conspirator. Their lives would be completely and permanently destroyed. Russo asked me if I was prepared to send my own wife and son to federal prison. He asked me if I wanted him to draft a quiet settlement proposal instead. He said we could use the evidence to blackmail them into returning the money quietly, saving the family from public ruin. I opened my eyes and looked at the glowing screen of my laptop. I saw the $12 million acquisition filing. I saw the offshore routing numbers. I saw the signature of my son on the dummy corporation. I thought about the decades I spent sacrificing my body to give them a perfect life. I thought about the limp in my leg, the missed holidays, and the endless nights I spent working to ensure they never wanted for anything. I thought about Diane calling me dead weight while she secretly sat on a mountain of my stolen wealth. I spoke into the phone, and my voice did not waver. I told Russo that my family died the moment they forged my signature. I told him there would be no quiet settlements. There would be no secret negotiations, and there would be no mercy. They wanted to play a high-stakes corporate game with my life, and I was going to show them how that game was actually played. I instructed Russo to begin compiling the evidence for a federal injunction. I told him to prepare the financial dossiers for the authorities. We were going to trap them so thoroughly that they would never see the sunlight again. The sun began to rise over the Connecticut suburbs, casting a cold morning light into my study. I closed the laptop and sat in the quiet room, feeling a terrifying sense of absolute purpose. My family was going to wake up in a few hours, smiling and pretending everything was normal. They had no idea that I was already digging their graves. The corporate betrayal was the final piece of the puzzle. I now possessed the full architecture of their conspiracy. I knew exactly how they stole the money, where they hid it, and who helped them do it. I had 48 hours before Diane planned to file the divorce papers. 48 hours to turn their perfect crime into a federal nightmare. I slowly stood up from my leather chair, ignoring the sharp pain in my leg. I smoothed the wrinkles from my shirt and prepared to walk out of the study. It was time to go make breakfast for the people who ruined my life. It was time to smile and play the fool one last time. The morning sun cast long shadows across the imported Italian marble of my kitchen floor. I walked down the hallway with a heavy, exaggerated limp, leaning heavily on my cane. I had to be the ghost they expected to see. Diane was already awake. She stood by the kitchen island, wearing a silk robe that cost more than my first delivery truck. She was sipping her artisan coffee and scrolling through her phone. She did not look up when I entered the room. She did not offer me a cup. She simply exhaled a quiet sigh of annoyance at the sound of my shuffling feet. I poured my own coffee. The dark liquid mirrored the cold, empty feeling in my chest. I stood by the window and looked out at the manicured lawn. The pieces of the puzzle were finally snapping together with absolute, terrifying clarity. I thought back to the dinner party the night before. I thought about Aaron sitting at the head of the table boasting about his new sprawling estate. He had described the custom wine cellar, the cascading infinity pool, and the imported hardwood floors with a sickening sense of pride. He acted like a brilliant titan of industry who had conquered the corporate world. The realization hit me so hard, it made my hands shake. Aaron was not a successful businessman. I was a thief playing dress-up with my money. Every single brick of that massive estate was paid for with the sweat I left on loading docks over the past 40 years. Every drop of water in his custom pool was funded by the $8 million he stole from my retirement buyout. He had looked me in the eyes and toasted to my hard work, knowing he was living inside a mansion built entirely on my stolen legacy. And then there was Nicole, my sweet, innocent daughter. I took a slow sip of my bitter coffee and let the reality of her betrayal wash over me. Over the past year, her lifestyle had drastically changed. She had started taking spontaneous trips to Aspen and Paris. She carried designer handbags that cost thousands of dollars. Her husband Colin had a failing startup company that miraculously never went bankrupt. Whenever I asked her how they were managing, she would smile sweetly and tell me Colin had found new angel investors. There were no angel investors. There was only the blind trust in the Cayman Islands. Nicole was co-managing the stolen millions. She was quietly siphoning off my wealth to fund her luxury vacations and keep her useless husband afloat. She had sat in my study just weeks ago, crying about a massive credit card bill and begging me for a temporary loan. I had written her a check for $15,000 to help her breathe easier. She took my money with tears of gratitude, knowing she was sitting on a mountain of my stolen cash. It was a sick, twisted game to her. She was testing my liquidity checking to see how easily I would open my wallet, while she and her brother plotted my complete financial ruin. The sheer audacity of their greed was paralyzing. They were not just securing their futures. They were aggressively bleeding me dry for sport. I looked across the kitchen at my wife. Diane was still typing on her phone, likely texting Campbell or Aaron to finalize the divorce logistics. She looked so comfortable, so entirely secure in her victory. A violent primal urge surged through my veins. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to slam my coffee mug against the granite counter. I wanted to march over to her, snatch the phone out of her hands, and tell her I knew absolutely everything. I wanted to watch the smug confidence drain from her face and be replaced by absolute terror. I wanted the pit of my stomach. Confronting her now would be a fatal, catastrophic mistake. If I caused a scene, Diane would instantly know the element of surprise was gone. She would send a single text message to Aaron. Aaron would panic. He would log into the offshore holding accounts and immediately wire the $13 million into untraceable cryptocurrency wallets or scatter it across a dozen untouchable foreign banks. The money was highly liquid. It could vanish with a single keystroke. If they moved the funds deeper into the international shadows, Russo. And I might spend a decade fighting in federal courts trying to recover it, and by that time I would be dead. Silence was my only leverage. I had to let them continue believing I was completely oblivious. I had to play the role of the defeated dead-weight husband perfectly. I turned away from the window and slowly shuffled to the kitchen table, making sure to drag my bad leg just a little more than usual. I let out a tired, heavy groan as I sat down. Diane finally looked up from her phone. Her eyes swept over me with a look of profound revulsion. She quickly looked back down at her screen, completely disgusted by the sight of the man who had given her everything. Her contempt fueled my focus. It sharpened my mind, removing any lingering guilt I might have felt about what I was going to do to the mother of my children. I pulled my secure phone from my pocket, keeping it hidden below the edge of the table. I sent a brief coded text to Russo confirming our strategy. We had to trap them legally and decisively before they even realized they were under attack. Russo replied within seconds. He was already coordinating with his contacts in the Federal Financial Crimes Division. We needed to freeze Aaron and Nicole out of the Cayman accounts, without alerting the domestic banking system they monitored. To do that, we needed an airtight legal snare. We needed to hit them with a federal injunction for wire fraud and embezzlement, so powerful that a judge would lock every single asset tied to their names instantly. But there was another layer to my defense. A massive hidden shield that Diane had completely forgotten about over the decades. 20 years ago, during a particularly dark period in our marriage, Diane had made a terrible financial mistake. She had attempted to secretly leverage one of my commercial shipping warehouses to pay off a massive gambling debt her brother had accumulated. I caught her before the bank approved the loan. To save our marriage and protect the business, I forced her to sign a comprehensive ironclad post-nuptial agreement. The document explicitly stated that if she ever attempted to defraud me or conceal marital assets, she would immediately forfeit her right to alimony, spousal support, and any share of my corporate wealth. She had signed it crying and promising she would never betray me again. Over the years, as the company grew into an empire and our lives became comfortable, she had completely erased the memory of that document from her mind. She thought it was just a piece of paper buried in the past. She had no idea that Russo had kept the original notarized copy safely locked in a fireproof vault in his downtown office for 2 decades. That document was my ultimate weapon. When Diane filed her divorce papers on Monday morning, expecting to walk away with half of my remaining domestic assets and her hidden offshore millions, she was going to hit a titanium wall. The post-nuptial agreement would trigger an immediate forfeiture of her entire estate claim. The second Russo presented the evidence of her current financial fraud. She was going to leave this marriage with absolutely nothing but the clothes on her back. But the trap had to be perfectly synchronized. If Aaron got wind of the federal injunction before the asset freeze cleared the international banking channels, he could still cause massive damage. I had to keep them all incredibly close. I needed to control their movements and monitor their communications for the next 48 hours. I finished my coffee and stood up from the table, moving with a slow, painful deliberation. Diane did not even say goodbye as I left the kitchen. I walked back down the hallway toward my study, feeling a strange sense of dark anticipation. My family thought they had orchestrated the perfect corporate heist. They thought they had cornered a weak old man and stripped him of his teeth. They were entirely wrong. I was not trapped in this house with them. They were trapped in this house with me. And I was going to systematically dismantle their entire universe brick by brick until there was absolutely nothing left but the ashes of their own greed. The weekend stretched out before me like a massive, silent battlefield. Every smile would be a calculated maneuver. Every word I spoke would be carefully weighed. I was going to give them the ultimate performance of a lifetime. I would let them push me exactly where they wanted me to go, right up until the moment I pulled the lever and sent them all plunging into the abyss. The sunlight streaming through the kitchen windows felt entirely different that Saturday morning. It was bright and warm, but to me it felt like standing under the harsh glare of an interrogation lamp. I shuffled down the hallway, dragging my bad leg with an exaggerated heavy thud against the hardwood floor. I rounded the corner into the kitchen and stopped. Diane was standing by the espresso machine. She was humming. I had not heard her hum a tune in the morning since we first moved into this house over 20 years ago. When she heard my uneven footsteps, she turned around. The look of pure disgust I had seen on her face the night before was completely gone. In its place was a bright, flawless, and terrifyingly sweet smile. "Good morning, Ronnie," she said, her voice dripping with artificial warmth. "I made your favorite roast. I know your leg was bothering you last night, so I thought you could use a strong cup." She poured the coffee into my favorite mug and slid it across the marble island toward me. The sudden shift in her demeanor was jarring. If I had not spent the entire night tracking her offshore money laundering, I might have actually believed she felt guilty for calling me dead weight at the dinner party. I might have believed she was trying to apologize. But I knew exactly what this was. This was the final act of her performance. She needed me docile, agreeable, and completely disarmed. "Thank you, Diane," I mumbled, keeping my eyes fixed on the mug. "My leg is giving me a bit of trouble today." "I appreciate it." I took a slow sip of the coffee. She stood there watching me with a calculated predatory patience. I knew she was waiting for an opening, and I did not have to wait long for her to make her move. "Actually, Ronnie, since you are resting today, I was hoping you could do me a tiny favor," she said casually, wiping down the pristine granite counter. "My accountant sent over a few routine tax documents for the new fiscal year. It is just some standard boilerplate stuff for the joint savings accounts, updating the beneficiary forms since you sold the logistics company. They need your signature before Monday." My heart skipped a single beat, but I kept my face perfectly neutral. Routine tax documents. She was moving faster than I anticipated. She wasn't just preparing the divorce filings with Campbell. She was trying to get me to sign the preliminary asset surrender forms right now, while I sat in my pajamas drinking the coffee she poured for me. If I put my name on those papers, I would be voluntarily signing away any legal contest to the millions they had already stolen. She wanted to hand the judge a signed confession of my own financial surrender on Monday morning. "Oh, taxes already?" I asked, letting out a heavy, tired sigh. "I thought we handled all of that during the corporate buyout." "Just a few loose ends," she replied breezily, walking over to the kitchen desk and picking up a thick manila folder. "It will take you 2 seconds. Just sign on the highlighted tabs." She walked over and placed the folder directly in front of me, sliding a silver pen across the counter. The folder was heavy, It was thick with legal jargon printed on crisp, high-quality paper. I stared down at the closed cover, feeling the immense weight of the trap she had laid out for me. I slowly reached out and opened the folder. My eyes skimmed the top page. It was formatted to look like a standard banking disclosure, but the header read Preliminary Asset Distribution and Partial Dissolution Waiver. I felt a surge of pure, unadulterated rage, but I swallowed it down instantly. I needed an excuse to delay the signature without arousing her suspicion. I could not outright refuse, or she would know I was onto her. I had to play the frail, broken old man perfectly. I picked up the first page and held it close to my face, squinting my eyes hard. I moved the paper back and forth, acting as though the text was completely blurring together. I let out a frustrated, shaky breath and rubbed my eyes with the back of my hand. "Diane, my reading glasses must be upstairs," I muttered, keeping my voice low and slightly embarrassed. "The print on this is awfully small. My eyes are just swimming this morning." Diane's sweet smile faltered for a fraction of a second, her jaw tightening in a brief flash of irritation. "Ronnie, it really is just standard banking forms. You do not even need to read it all. Just sign where the yellow tabs are. The accountant needs it by Monday." I know, I said, setting the paper back down and rubbing my temples. "But you know how I am with contracts, Diane. 40 years of running the logistics business. I never sign anything without reading the fine print. It is just an old habit I cannot shake. Let me take these into the study. I will find my glasses and read them over this weekend. I promise I will have them signed and ready for you by Sunday night." I looked up at her, offering a weak, apologetic smile. I made sure to look as pathetic and harmless as possible. She stared at me, her eyes narrowing slightly as she weighed her options. Pushing me too hard right now might make me stubborn, and she needed this to go smoothly. She needed me to remain a docile, trusting fool. She let out a soft, understanding sigh and reached over to pat my hand. "Of course, Ronnie. You take your time. There is no rush. Just make sure they are ready by Sunday evening so I can drop them off first thing Monday morning. I promised, picking up the heavy folder and the silver pen. "Thank you for handling the accounting, Diane. It is a relief not to have to worry about it anymore." She smiled, a cold, victorious smirk playing on her lips. "You are welcome. Go rest your leg." I turned away from this kitchen island, clutching the manila folder against my chest like a shield. I shuffled down the hallway, dragging my bad leg, listening to the sound of my wife humming a cheerful tune behind me. The second I stepped into my dark study and locked the heavy oak door, the facade completely vanished. I stood up straight, the fake limp disappearing instantly. I tossed the folder onto my desk with absolute disgust. She had just handed me the physical proof of her betrayal. I did not just have digital banking records anymore. I had the physical legal documents Campbell had drafted to strip me of my wealth. I picked up my secure phone and dialed Mr. Russo's number. The weekend was slipping away, but Diane had just given me exactly what I needed to spring the trap. She wanted these papers signed by Sunday night. I was going to give her a Sunday night she would never, ever forget. I stared down at the thick manila folder sitting on my polished mahogany desk. The silver pen Diane had given me rested right beside it, catching the dim light of the study. I opened the cover again and looked at the bright yellow sticky tabs pointing exactly to where I was supposed to sign my life away. Preliminary Asset Distribution and Marital Dissolution Waiver. Reading those legal words in the cold light of day brought a fresh wave of absolute disgust. She had literally handed me my own financial death warrant while pouring me a cup of morning coffee. She had smiled at me while doing it. I carefully turned the pages, reading every single line of the elaborate legal trap her lawyer Campbell had built. They had thought of absolutely everything. The document demanded that I surrender all voting rights to my remaining corporate investments. It required me to sign over the deed to the house we lived in. It even contained a buried clause waiving my right to seek independent legal counsel, disguised cleverly as a mutual agreement to streamline our annual tax process. It was a masterpiece of malicious legal deception. If I had been the tired, oblivious old man they truly thought I was, I would have signed it without a second thought. I picked up my secure private phone and dialed Mr. Russo. I told my lawyer exactly what Diane had just handed me in the kitchen. I told him she expected the signed papers returned to her by Sunday night, so she could file them on Monday morning. Russo did not laugh, but I could hear the grim, dark satisfaction in his heavy voice. He told me that Diane had just handed us the final nail for her own coffin. By presenting me with fraudulent asset surrender forms, under the guise of routine tax documents, she had officially crossed a massive legal boundary. She had committed attempted extortion and mail fraud. She had crossed the line from a bitter wife trying to hide marital money into an active criminal trying to rob a senior citizen blind. I asked Russo about the status of our immediate counterstrike. He told me his legal team had been working continuously through the night without sleep. The sheer magnitude of Aaron and his wire fraud was far too large for a local family court to handle. Russo had bypassed the state level entirely and gone straight to a powerful contact he maintained within the Federal Financial Crimes Division. Because my son, Aaron, had used digital routing networks to move $8 million of stolen corporate buyout funds across international borders, he had intentionally triggered a major federal jurisdiction. Russo was currently finalizing an emergency federal injunction against my own son. This was not going to be a simple freeze on a local bank account. This was a catastrophic legal weapon designed to destroy financial terrorists. Russo explained that once the federal judge signed the emergency injunction, Aaron and his entire life would be locked down instantly. The federal authorities would immediately freeze the Cayman Islands Blind Trust, leaving the stolen millions trapped offshore. They would seize the sprawling multi-million-dollar estate Aaron had just purchased with my stolen legacy. They would lock his domestic checking accounts, his investment portfolios, and his corporate retirement funds. Aaron would not be able to buy a cup of coffee, let alone hire a high-priced white-collar defense attorney to save himself. Russo warned me again about the permanent consequences of this action. He reminded me that once he submitted the federal injunction, I could never take it back. The federal government does not simply drop a massive investigation into $8 million of internationally laundered money just because a father changes his mind and wants to forgive his son. Aaron would be looking at decades in a maximum security federal penitentiary. He would lose his lucrative corporate career. He would lose his freedom and his future. I sat in my quiet study and looked at a framed photograph sitting on my bookshelf. It was a picture of Aaron when he was 10 years old, wearing a dirty baseball uniform and smiling widely while holding a championship trophy. I had paid for that uniform. I had paid for that league. I had broken my body, working double shifts, hauling freight across the country, just so he could smile exactly like that. I remembered how he looked last night, at the lavish dinner table smirking into his expensive crystal wine glass, while his mother publicly called me dead weight. The innocent boy in the photograph was long gone. In his place was a greedy, arrogant thief who felt absolutely no remorse about stealing my life savings and leaving me to die in utter poverty. I told Russo to file the federal injunction immediately. I told him I wanted the legal net pulled so tight that Aaron would not even be able to breathe without asking a federal judge for permission. Russo confirmed the heavy paperwork would be submitted electronically to the emergency duty judge within the hour. By the time Aaron woke up on Monday morning, federal agents would be waiting on his front porch. With my son completely neutralized, my attention turned back to Diane. I asked Russo how we were going to handle the aggressive divorce filings she planned to submit on Monday morning. I knew the offshore money would be frozen safely out of her reach, but Diane still expected to walk away with half of my remaining domestic assets, the house, and a massive alimony settlement. Russo let out a low, rough sound over the phone that might have been a laugh. He told me I did not need to worry about Diane taking the house. He told me I did not need to worry about paying alimony, providing spousal support, or splitting the remaining corporate pension funds ever again. He asked me if I remembered the terrible marital crisis we faced 20 years ago. The memory surfaced instantly bitter and incredibly sharp. 20 years ago, Diane had a brother who was hopelessly addicted to underground gambling. He had racked up a massive, dangerous debt with some very bad people. Diane had panicked out of desperation. Without telling me a single word, she had forged my signature on a massive commercial loan application, attempting to illegally leverage one of my most profitable shipping warehouses to bail her brother out of his mess. I caught the fraudulent banking application the exact day before the bank approved the transfer. It almost destroyed our entire marriage. It almost bankrupted my young logistics company. To save the business, and because I was foolish enough to believe she still truly loved me, I agreed not to press criminal charges against her. But Russo had been my corporate lawyer back then too. He had absolutely insisted on protecting me from her reckless behavior. He drafted a comprehensive ironclad post-nuptial agreement. Diane had signed it in his downtown office, weeping uncontrollably, and swearing to God she would never deceive me or steal from me ever again. I had put the painful incident behind me, burying it deep in the past, as my business grew into a massive empire. Over the decades, I had honestly forgotten the document even existed, but Russo never forgets anything. He told me he was holding the original notarized copy of the post-nuptial agreement in his hands right now. He read the primary fraud clause aloud to me over the secure phone line. The legal language was absolute and devastating. It stated clearly that if Diane ever attempted to conceal marital assets, commit financial fraud against me, or forge my signature on any legal document, she would immediately forfeit her right to the entire marital estate. She would completely waive all claims to future alimony. She would surrender any claim to my corporate wealth. She would walk away from the marriage with absolutely nothing but the clothes on her back. By handing me those fake tax documents this morning, and by conspiring directly with Aaron to hide $8 million in an offshore trust, Diane had triggered the forfeiture clause perfectly. She had spent months building an elaborate trap for me, but she had accidentally locked herself inside it. I felt a profound, heavy sense of finality settle over my shoulders. The counter-strike was fully loaded and ready to deploy. Russo and I had spent the last 14 hours moving in total secrecy, wrapping an invisible steel cable around the throats of my betrayers. They had no idea they were already completely dead. They were walking around the house making grand plans for their new millions, completely oblivious to the fact that their financial execution had already been scheduled and confirmed. Russo told me he would have a trusted private courier deliver a secure briefcase to my home on Sunday afternoon. The briefcase would contain the federal injunction orders, the offshore banking ledgers bearing Aaron and Nicole checking signatures, and the original ironclad post-nuptial agreement. It would be every single piece of ammunition I needed to confront them and burn their world to the ground. I thanked Russo for his decades of unwavering loyalty. He told me to stay alert, keep my head down, and keep playing the fool until the very last possible second. I hung up the secure phone and leaned far back in my leather chair. I looked around the quiet study I had occupied for so many years. I thought about the sheer blind arrogance of my family. They truly believed my silence meant I was weak and defeated. They believed my heavy limp meant I was helpless and slow. They had spent months digging a deep grave for me, measuring the dimensions perfectly, picking out the expensive headstone, and laughing at me while they did it. They just forgot to check who was actually holding the shovel. I spent the rest of Saturday and the entirety of Sunday moving through the large house like a quiet, invisible ghost. I dragged my bad leg heavily across the floorboards. I spoke softly and avoided eye contact. I thanked Diane gracefully every single time she poured my coffee or handed me a plate of food. I watched her smile, her fake venomous smile, knowing she was eagerly counting down the hours until she could finally discard me like trash. Tomorrow evening, she would aggressively ask for the signed tax documents. She would call all the children over for a sudden family meeting to force me out of my own home and demand my surrender. I just had to wait for the sun to go down. The storm was rapidly approaching, and I was going to be the one bringing the absolute thunder. The private courier arrived exactly at 3 in the afternoon. I met him at the side gate hidden from the view of the main house. The heavy leather briefcase he handed me felt like the physical weight of justice itself. I carried it quietly into my study and locked it inside my hidden safe. The evidence was finally in my possession. The federal injunction orders demanding the immediate freeze of the offshore accounts were signed by a judge. The banking ledgers showing my children as the managing directors of the Blind Trust were printed and highlighted. The original post-nuptial agreement that would strip my wife of absolutely everything she owned was sitting right on top. Everything was ready. I just had to wait for the sun to go down. Diane spent the entire Sunday afternoon pacing the house. Her cheerful humming from Saturday morning had completely vanished, replaced by a tight, nervous energy. She was growing restless and dangerously impatient. Every time she walked past my study, she would pause and let out a heavy, dramatic sigh. She wanted those signed tax documents. She desperately needed my physical signature on the asset surrender forms to guarantee a smooth, uncontested transfer of wealth on Monday morning. I remained locked in my study, ignoring her heavy sighs. I sat in the dark, pretending to struggle with the legal jargon, acting like a confused old man whose mind was rapidly slipping away. At exactly 6 in the evening, the doorbell rang. I heard the heavy wooden front door swing open and the sound of hushed voices echoing through the grand foyer. My children had arrived. I stayed in my leather chair, listening to their quiet murmurs drift down the hallway. They were not laughing. They were not talking about their weekend plans or complaining about the traffic. They were speaking in low, urgent tones. The executioners were gathering in the living room to review their final strategy before they brought the prisoner to the block. Diane knocked on my study door. It was a sharp, aggressive sound. "Ronnie," she called out, her voice loud and commanding. "Come out to the living room right now. Aaron and Nicole are here to see you." I stood up very slowly. I grabbed my wooden cane and dragged my bad leg across the floorboards. I made sure my steps sounded heavy, exhausted, and defeated. I opened the door and offered her a confused, tired smile. She did not return the smile. Her face was set in a rigid mask of deep, tragic concern. It was a flawless performance. I followed her down the long hallway and stepped into the formal living room. The space was normally reserved for her high society friends. It was filled with pristine white furniture, fragile crystal vases, and expensive modern art. Aaron was standing by the large stone fireplace wearing a dark, casual suit. He looked incredibly tense, shifting his weight from foot to foot, like a predator waiting to strike. Rachel sat perched on the edge of a white sofa, clutching her designer handbag against her chest like a protective shield. Nicole was sitting next to her husband, Colin, holding a thick, glossy folder tightly in her lap. When I entered the room, they all turned to look at me simultaneously. Their faces were uniform masks of artificial pity and deep sorrow. No one offered me a glass of water. No one asked how my aching leg was feeling. They simply watched me shuffle across the expensive Persian rug and sink heavily into a wingback armchair. Aaron cleared his throat loud in the quiet room. He looked at his mother and then looked down at me. "Dad," he began, his voice thick with a fake, heavy sorrow. "We needed to have a very important family discussion tonight. We are all deeply worried about you." I looked around the room, letting my eyes dart back and forth from face to face like a frightened, confused old man cornered by wolves. "Worried about me?" I asked, letting my voice tremble just enough to sound vulnerable. "Why is everyone looking at me like that? Did something bad happen?" Diane sat down on the sofa directly across from me. She leaned forward and clasped her hands tightly together, resting them on her knees. "Ronnie, we have to be completely honest with each other," she said softly. "You have not been yourself lately. We have all noticed the decline. You are forgetting things all the time. You are becoming isolated and withdrawn. You are struggling with basic daily tasks, and it is becoming dangerous." I gripped the handle of my cane and stared at her, trying to project fear. What basic tasks, I asked, defensively, playing perfectly into their narrative. I am just tired, Diane. The leg has been bothering me more than usual. Diane let out a tragic, dramatic sigh. She reached over to the glass coffee table and picked up the thick manila folder she had given me on Saturday morning. The folder I had left sitting on my desk, intentionally unsigned. She placed it gently back onto the table right in front of me, tapping the cover with her manicured fingernail. Ronnie, I gave you these simple tax updates yesterday morning, she said, her tone shifting into a slow, patronizing cadence as if she were speaking to a toddler. They were standard, straightforward banking forms. You told me you could not read them. You told me the words were blurring together, and you were completely confused by the paperwork. You have managed massive corporate taxes for 40 years, and suddenly you cannot even read a basic banking disclosure. Your mind is slipping, Ronnie. Aaron immediately stepped in, perfectly timing his part of the routine. Dad, it is not just the paperwork. You have been completely disconnected from reality. At the dinner party on Friday, you were entirely withdrawn from the conversation. You were staring blankly at the wall, and then you violently shattered a wine glass. You did not even try to clean it up. You just stared at the broken glass and wandered away into the dark, like you did not know where you were. Nicole nodded vigorously, wiping a completely fake tear from the corner of her eye. We love you so much, Dad. She whispered, her voice cracking with calculated emotion. But it is absolutely terrifying to watch you decline like this. You are a danger to yourself. You cannot manage your own daily routine anymore, and it is breaking Mom to carry this heavy burden all by herself. She is physically and emotionally exhausted trying to care for you. I looked at my daughter. The daughter who was currently listed as the co-managing director of an offshore blind trust holding $13 million of my stolen money. She was sitting in my living room wearing a designer dress I paid for, crying fake tears and telling me I was losing my mind. The sheer psychopathy required to look a father in the eyes and deliver that performance was breathtaking. What are you saying? I asked, letting my shoulders slump forward in apparent defeat. What do all of you want from me? Diane reached out and touched my knee. It was a cold, lifeless touch that made my skin crawl. Ronnie, we want you to be safe, she said softly. We want you to be in an environment where trained medical professionals can monitor your cognitive decline 24 hours a day. We cannot provide the intensive medical care you are going to need. It is simply not fair to the family, and it is not safe for you to remain in this large house. Nicole opened the glossy folder resting in her lap. She pulled out a stack of expensive-looking brochures and spread them across the glass coffee table next to the unsigned tax documents. The brochures featured pictures of smiling senior citizens sitting in manicured gardens and playing cards in brightly lit common rooms. We found an incredible assisted living facility, Nicole said, pointing to the glossy pages. It is a premium memory care estate, just 2 hours upstate. They specialize in severe cognitive decline and dementia. They have a secure locked wall so you cannot wander off and hurt yourself. They have a bed opening up this week, and we went ahead and paid the deposit to secure your spot. Aaron stepped closer to my chair, towering over me to establish physical dominance. He crossed his arms over his broad chest. We are doing this because we love you, Dad, he said, his voice hard, cold, and uncompromising. But this is not a negotiation. You are going to pack a small bag tonight. We are driving you up to the facility tomorrow morning. Mom is going to take over full medical and financial power of attorney starting on Monday. She will handle the estate, the house, and all the remaining finances, so you do not have to stress your failing mind anymore. I stared down at the colorful brochures scattered across my coffee table. Sunset Meadows Memory Care. They had actually found a locked medical facility for me. They intended to physically remove me from my own home, drive me 2 hours into the mountains, and lock me inside a dementia ward. Once I was securely locked behind those heavy medical doors, Diane would submit the divorce filings and claim complete power of attorney over my entire life. I would never be allowed to leave. I would spend the rest of my natural life trapped in a small, sterile room, fed a daily diet of heavy sedatives, while my wife and children spent my life savings on luxury cars and overseas vacations. The psychological violence of their plan was absolute. They did not just want to rob me. They wanted to erase my identity. They wanted to strip away my freedom, my dignity, and my basic human rights. They wanted to bury me alive and throw away the key. I looked up slowly, meeting the eyes of every single person in the room. Colin was checking his fingernails, looking entirely bored. Rachel was staring at her diamond bracelet, waiting for this tedious chore to end. Nicole was putting on her best mask of tragic sympathy. Aaron was glaring down at me, fully expecting me to crumble and surrender. And Diane was sitting perfectly straight on the white sofa, waiting to claim her final ultimate victory. They had backed me perfectly into the corner. They had laid out all their cards on the table. They had exposed their entire malicious strategy under the guise of an emotional family intervention. They truly believed they had executed the perfect crime. They believed the weak, confused old man sitting in the armchair was entirely at their mercy and too broken to fight back. I took a slow, deep breath, feeling the cold, hard steel of reality settle into my chest. I did not feel any fear. I did not feel any sorrow. The old man they thought they knew had died on Friday night. The man sitting in the chair right now was a predator, and the trap was finally fully set. The silence hung heavy and thick in the formal living room. I sat perfectly still in the wingback armchair, letting my eyes drift from the glossy medical brochures scattered across the glass coffee table to the faces of the people I used to call my family. Aaron stood tall by the stone fireplace, puffing out his chest and crossing his arms over his expensive suit. He was waiting for my defense. He was waiting for the weak and frail old man to cry or beg for mercy. I wanted me to ask them to reconsider and plead for my freedom. I did not give him that satisfaction. I simply stared at him while the antique grandfather clock in the hallway ticked loudly, marking the final seconds of their reign. Aaron mistook my silence for total submission. He took a heavy step forward and slapped his hand down on the coffee table right next to the manila folder. He told me that my silence proved exactly what they had been saying all along. He said my brain was completely failing and that I could not even process a simple conversation anymore. He pointed a finger directly at my face and told me that this forced relocation was for my own good, and that fighting back would only make the transition more painful for everyone involved. Rachel shifted on the white sofa, running her hand over her diamond bracelet and letting out a loud, exaggerated sigh. She told Aaron they needed to wrap this intervention up quickly because they had dinner reservations at a fancy restaurant across town. She spoke about me as if I were a broken household appliance they were waiting for the garbage collectors to haul away. Nicole nodded in agreement and checked her phone, completely dropping the act of the weeping and concerned daughter. The fake tears she had wiped away just moments ago were entirely gone. Her face was as hard and cold as carved marble. Colin muttered something about how traffic was going to be terrible if they left too late. None of them saw a human being sitting in the chair across from them. They only saw an obstacle standing between them and a massive fortune. Diane finally lost her patience with the theatrical performance. She unclasped her hands and leaned forward on the white sofa. The mask of the tragic and exhausted wife melted away from her face completely. It was replaced by a look of sheer, calculating triumph. She looked me directly in the eyes, and her voice dropped its patronizing tone. She told me that we did not need to pretend anymore. She stated clearly that my mind might be slipping, but she knew I was still aware enough to understand that I had finally lost. She reached across the glass table and picked up the thick manila folder containing the forms she had tried to pass off as simple tax updates yesterday morning. She flipped the folder open and flattened the pages against the table with the palm of her hand. She pointed to the yellow sticky tabs and told me that these were not routine banking disclosures. She admitted with a completely straight face that they were marital dissolution waivers and preliminary asset surrender agreements. She was telling me straight to my face that she was divorcing me and taking absolutely everything. She informed me that she had already contacted her lawyer and the papers were fully prepared for the judge. She told me that signing the papers tonight would simply make the process cleaner and faster for everyone. She said that if I signed the papers, she would make sure the nurses at the memory care facility treated me well. She promised to send a check every month to cover a premium room with a window facing the gardens. But she made it abundantly clear that if I refused to sign, she would have a judge declare me mentally incompetent by Tuesday morning. She said she would drag my name through a brutal public court hearing and expose me as a violent, confused old man who shattered glasses at dinner parties and could not remember his own bank accounts. She told me she was taking the house, the cars, and the entire remaining balance of the corporate buyout. She looked around this pristine living room and proudly declared that she was not going to spend the best years of her life acting as a nursemaid to a man who dragged a dead leg around her beautiful floors. She told me she deserved the millions I had earned because she had tolerated my long working hours and my boring personality for 40 decades. The sheer brazen confidence of her admission was staggering. She felt so untouchable that she was openly confessing to financial extortion in front of 4 witnesses. But those witnesses were her accomplices. Aaron moved to stand right behind his mother, placing his hands on her shoulders in a show of unified strength. He looked down at me and told me that Mom was right. He said that I had outlived my usefulness to this family. He actually used those exact words. I told me that my era was over, and it was time for the next generation to take control of the wealth. He bragged that he was much better equipped to manage the millions than a retired truck driver who did not understand modern corporate finance. He smirked and told me that the business world had moved past me and my archaic way of doing things. He said that hiding my money in local savings accounts was foolish, and that he had much bigger plans for the family legacy. Hearing him brag about modern finance, while I knew he was secretly running an illegal offshore blind trust, was almost poetic. Nicole leaned over and whispered something to Rachel. Rachel laughed quietly and pointed toward the hallway leading to my study. I listened closely as Rachel casually suggested they knock down the walls of my study and turn the space into a custom wine tasting room for Diane. Nicole agreed enthusiastically and promised to call her interior designer first thing Monday morning. They were already redecorating my house while I was still sitting in the living room breathing the air. They were dividing up my corpse before my heart had even stopped beating. They discussed tossing out my leather chair and throwing away the heavy wooden desk where I had managed my logistics company for years. Colin chimed in and asked if he could have my collection of vintage pocket watches, since I would not be allowed to keep sharp objects in the dementia ward anyway. The casual cruelty of their conversation was breathtaking. They had successfully dehumanized me so thoroughly that my presence in the room did not even register as a deterrent to their greed. Diane picked up the heavy silver pen from the coffee table. She stood up from the sofa and walked slowly over to my armchair. She stood over me, blocking the light from the chandelier above. She held the pen out, offering it to me like a judge offering a condemned man a final cigarette. She told me that the transport car was arriving at 8 in the morning to drive me up to the mountains. She said the facility had a very strict packing list, and she had already instructed the housekeeper to pack a small bag of basic, comfortable clothing for me. She told me I would not need my phone, my house keys, or my wallet, because the facility handled all personal needs internally. She was stripping me of every single connection to the outside world. She told me to take the pen and sign my name on the yellow tabs immediately. She promised that once the ink was dry, my struggles would finally be over. She said I could finally rest in a quiet, locked room where people would feed me and make sure I did not fall and hurt myself. She leaned down so her face was only inches from mine. I could smell the expensive floral perfume I had purchased for her last anniversary. She whispered that she had won. She told me that I was completely isolated and that no one was ever coming to save me. She said the lawyers were paid, the doctors were briefed, and the facility was waiting. She demanded that I stop being difficult and just accept my fate like a good, defeated man. I looked at the silver pen hovering right in front of my face. I looked at the thick manila folder resting on the glass table. I looked at Aaron grinning confidently by the fireplace, and Nicole checking her designer watch to see how long this was going to take. I absorbed every single word they had spoken. I let their arrogance, their cruelty, and their absolute certainty wash over me. I allowed the heavy silence to stretch out for one final long moment, ensuring that their sense of total victory reached its absolute peak. Then I slowly reached out my calloused hand and took the silver pen from my wife. I held the silver pen in my hand. The smooth metal felt cold against my palm. Diane was smiling a tight, impatient smile, waiting for me to press the ink against the yellow tabs. Aaron let out a loud breath and told me to just sign the papers so they could go to dinner. I looked at the pen. I looked at the glossy brochures for the memory care ward scattered across the glass table, and then I gently placed the silver pen back down. I did not drop it. I placed it with absolute deliberate care. Diane frowned. Her smile vanished instantly. She asked me what I was doing and ordered me to pick the pen back up. I did not listen to her. I placed both of my hands on the armrests of my chair, and I pushed myself up. I did not use my wooden cane. I left it resting against the side of the chair. I stood up completely straight, pulling my shoulders back and lifting my chin. The heavy, exhausted slump I had worn all weekend completely disappeared. I stood at my full height, towering over Diane, who was forced to take a step back in surprise. My right leg did not tremble. I planted my feet firmly on the expensive Persian rug. Aaron stopped leaning against the fireplace and stood up straight, staring at me with sudden confusion. Rachel stopped playing with her diamond bracelet. The room went dead silent. I reached inside the interior pocket of my jacket. I pulled out a thick, folded leather document wallet. It was the package my private courier had delivered earlier that afternoon. I tossed it onto the glass coffee table. It landed with a loud, heavy smack directly on top of the colorful medical brochures and the fake tax documents Diane had prepared. I looked directly into my wife's eyes. I told her I would not be needing the premium corner room at Sunset Meadows. I told her my memory was actually functioning perfectly. In fact, I told her my memory was so sharp that I could recall the exact words her lawyer Campbell had spoken to me at 10:15 on Friday night. Diane froze. Her eyes darted to the leather folder. I told her Campbell was a very arrogant man, but he was terribly careless with his dialing. I recited his words exactly. I told her the asset concealment is complete and the blind trust is fully funded in the offshore accounts. The blood instantly drained from Diane's face. Her skin turned the color of ash. She stumbled backward until the back of her knees hit the white sofa, and she collapsed onto the cushions. She opened her mouth to speak, but no sound came out. She looked like she had just seen a ghost. Aaron stepped forward, his face flushing bright red. He puffed out his chest, trying to regain the physical dominance he thought he had over me. He pointed a finger at my chest and demanded to know what I was talking about. He said I was having a psychotic episode and that I was completely delusional. I did not blink. I reached down and flipped open the leather folder. I pulled out a stack of banking ledgers printed on crisp legal paper. I tossed them across the glass table, sliding them directly to where Aaron was standing. I told him he should be very careful about calling people delusional when there is a documented paper trail of international money laundering sitting right in front of him. Aaron looked down at the papers. His eyes locked onto the Cayman Islands bank logo printed at the top of the page. The arrogant flush of anger on his face vanished completely. He started to shake. I told him I knew all about the dummy corporation. I told him I knew about the $13 million sitting in the Caribbean bank. Nicole jumped up from her seat next to Colin. She demanded to know what those papers were. She tried to play the innocent peacemaker one last time. She told me I was confused and that Aaron was just trying to help me with my retirement funds. I turned my gaze to my daughter. I pulled the second set of documents from the folder. It was the original registration certificates for the offshore holding company. I tossed them onto the table next to the banking ledgers. I told Nicole to look at the bottom of the final page. I told her to look at the 2 signatures listed under the authorized managing directors. I read her name aloud in the quiet room. Nicole stepped back, her hands flying up to cover her mouth. Colin stood up and looked at the papers, his face twisting in sudden panic. He had clearly known about the money, but seeing the physical evidence of international fraud sitting on the coffee table broke his arrogant composure. I told Nicole she was no longer a sweet, struggling daughter, asking her father for credit card loans. I told her she was a fully documented co-conspirator in a massive financial crime. Nicole began to cry, real panicked tears dropping back onto the sofa and clutching her head. Aaron tried to recover his posture. He swallowed hard and told me that none of this mattered. He stammered out a weak defense, saying that the corporate buyout was a private family matter and that the money was legally his because he brokered the deal. He said I could not prove he did anything wrong. I looked at the son I had worked 80-hour weeks to provide for. I felt absolutely no pity for the man standing in front of me. I pulled the final stack of papers from the leather folder. It was the official acquisition filing from the Securities and Exchange Commission. I held it up so Aaron could see the bold black ink. I told him I knew the purchasing conglomerate paid $12 million for my logistics company. I told him I knew he forged the valuation documents and handed me a fake contract for $4 million. I told him he stole $8 million from his own father before the ink on my retirement papers was even dry. Aaron stopped breathing. He stared at the SEC filing as if he were looking at a loaded weapon. He realized that this was not a domestic dispute anymore. This was a paper trail leading directly to his complete ruin. I stepped closer to him, invading his personal space and forcing him to look me in the eyes. I dropped the final bomb. I told Aaron that I had not spent the weekend crying or losing my mind. I had spent the weekend with my corporate wealth management lawyer. I told him that my lawyer had gone completely over the heads of the local family courts. I told Aaron that we had filed an emergency federal injunction with the Financial Crimes Division. I watched his eyes widen in pure, unadulterated terror. I informed him that a federal judge had already signed the orders. The offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands were completely frozen. The dummy corporations were locked down tighter than a bank vault. Aaron opened his mouth, but could not form a single word. He looked like a man who had just been sentenced to the electric chair, but I did not stop there. I looked at Rachel, who was shaking violently on the sofa, her hand gripping her diamond tennis bracelet. I told Aaron that the federal authorities trace everything. I told him the FBI had already seized his sprawling multi-million-dollar estate, pending a massive federal investigation into wire fraud and corporate embezzlement. I told him federal agents were likely putting padlocks on his custom wine cellar doors right at this very moment. Aaron collapsed to his knees. He literally fell onto the expensive Persian rug, gasping for air as a full-blown panic attack seized his chest. He clutched his hair and began to rock back and forth, muttering that his life was over and that he was going to federal prison. Diane watched her golden boy collapse onto the floor. The reality of the federal investigation finally pierced through her shock. She scrambled off the sofa and crawled toward my feet. She grabbed my pant leg and looked up at me with wild, desperate eyes. She begged me to call my lawyer and stop the injunction. She told me that Aaron was my son and that sending him to federal prison would destroy the family forever. She promised she would rip up the divorce papers right now. She swore she would cancel the memory care facility and that things could go back to normal if I just dropped the federal charges. She was bartering for her own survival, using the illusion of our marriage as a bargaining chip. I looked down at the woman who had called me dead weight. I gently pulled my leg away from her grasp, stepping back. So she was left kneeling on the floor next to her sobbing son. I told Diane that the family was already destroyed the moment she handed me the fake tax documents. I told her that federal crimes cannot simply be canceled because a guilty wife decides she wants to play house again. The authorities had the evidence, and there was absolutely no turning back. The room descended into absolute chaos. But I stood perfectly still, watching the destruction I had unleashed upon the people who thought they could bury me alive. The moment the reality of the federal investigation settled over the room, the fragile alliances that held my family together completely shattered. Aaron scrambled backward on the expensive Persian rug, pushing away from his mother as if she had suddenly caught fire. He pointed a trembling finger at Diane and screamed that this was all her fault. He yelled that he never wanted to touch the offshore accounts and that she had pressured him into creating the dummy corporations. He cried out that she was the one who wanted the divorce and that he was just trying to protect his inheritance from being squandered. Diane let out a piercing shriek of pure outrage. She scrambled to her feet, letting her designer silk robe slip off her shoulder. She pointed right back at her son and screamed that he was a manipulative liar. She told Aaron he was the one who forged the corporate valuation documents long before she ever decided to file for divorce. She reminded him loudly that he stole the initial $8 million all on his own, and she merely helped him hide it. They were tearing each other to pieces right in front of me, desperate to throw their own flesh and blood to the wolves just to save themselves. Nicole did not try to intervene or play the peacemaker. She sat frozen on the white sofa, clutching her stomach and rocking back and forth as tears ruined her expensive makeup. Colin, her husband, slowly backed toward the foyer. He looked at Nicole with absolute terror and told her he was not going to federal prison for a family he only married into. He turned his back on his crying wife and walked out the front door, abandoning her to the authorities without a second glance. Rachel immediately followed suit. She ripped the diamond tennis bracelet off her wrist, threw it directly at the chest of Aaron, and ran out the door, shouting that she was calling her own divorce lawyer. I stood perfectly still, letting the chaotic symphony of their destruction wash over me. I reached into my interior jacket pocket one last time and pulled out the final document. It was folded neatly printed on aged, heavily watermarked paper. I walked over to the glass coffee table and set it down right next to the colorful medical brochures they had tried to use to bury me alive. I told Diane to look at the paper. I told her it was the original notarized copy of the post-nuptial agreement she had signed 20 years ago in the downtown office of Mr. Russo. Diane stopped screaming at Aaron. She looked down at the document, and her entire body began to tremble violently. She slowly reached out and touched the aged paper, tracing her own signature at the bottom of the page. I told her the fraud clause was absolute and unforgiving. I told her that by handing me those fake tax documents this morning and conspiring to hide marital assets, she had legally forfeited her right to absolutely everything. I told her she would receive no alimony, no spousal support, and absolutely no claim to my corporate wealth or this house. I told her she was walking away from 40 years of marriage with nothing but the clothes currently on her back. She fell to her knees, weeping uncontrollably. She begged me to forgive her. She crawled across the expensive rug and tried to grab my hands, swearing that she was just scared of getting older and that she still loved me. I looked down at the woman I had spent my entire adult life trying to make happy. I felt absolutely nothing. The love I once had for her had been completely burned away by her profound cruelty. I gently stepped back, leaving her grasping at empty air. I told them the police and the federal agents would be arriving shortly. I told Aaron and Nicole they needed to find exceptional criminal defense attorneys because the Federal Financial Crimes Division rarely loses a case. I told them they had traded their freedom and their family for a pile of stolen money they would never get to spend. I turned my back on the weeping, miserable people sitting in my formal living room. I did not raise my voice or offer any grand final speeches. I simply buttoned my jacket, picked up my wooden cane, and walked down the long hallway toward the front door. My right leg still ached, but my steps were steady, firm, and full of purpose. I did not drag my feet anymore. I walked like a man who had just reclaimed his entire world. When I opened the heavy front door, the cool evening air hit my face. It smelled like rain and pine trees and absolute freedom. A sleek black town car was parked in the circular driveway, idling quietly under the glow of the street lamps. Mr. Russo was standing by the open rear door wearing his usual immaculate dark suit. He offered me a rare, respectful nod as I approached. I walked down the front steps and did not look back at the sprawling six-bedroom house. I did not look back at the expensive manicured lawn or the large oak trees I had planted decades ago. The house was no longer a home. It was a crime scene waiting for the authorities to arrive. I climbed into the comfortable leather seat of the town car. Mr. Russo closed the door with a solid, reassuring thud and climbed into the front passenger seat. The driver smoothly pulled the car out of the driveway and onto the quiet suburban street, leaving the estate far behind in the rearview mirror. Russo looked over his shoulder and told me the offshore accounts were successfully secured under my sole legal authority. He confirmed that the $12 million had been completely recovered and untangled from the blind trust. He told me the authorities were already processing the warrants for Aaron, Diane, and Nicole. He asked me where I wanted to go tonight. I told Russo to take me to the airport. I told him I wanted to see the ocean. The car merged onto the highway, speeding smoothly into the night. I let out a long, slow breath and closed my eyes, feeling the heavy weight of the last 40 years finally lift from my shoulders. I thought about the hard physical labor, the endless nights shivering in cold warehouses, and the millions of miles I had driven to build my logistics company. I had done it all for a family that never truly appreciated a single drop of my sweat. But I was no longer a victim of their ungrateful greed. I had faced the ultimate betrayal and emerged completely victorious. I was walking away with every single penny I had earned, and my dignity was absolutely intact. The people who tried to bury me alive were currently sitting in the ruins of their own malicious arrogance, waiting for the federal agents to put them in handcuffs. They would spend the next decade in federal prison, reflecting on the exact moment they underestimated the quiet old man they called dead weight. I opened my eyes and watched the dark landscape roll by, feeling a profound, quiet joy settle deep into my bones. For the first time in my entire life, I was completely and truly at peace. The ultimate lesson drawn from Ronald's silent retribution is that true power does not reside in loud confrontations or public displays of arrogance, but in quiet, calculated resilience. When greed and materialism replace genuine familial love, those who underestimate the silent sacrifices of their providers often engineer their own downfall. Betrayal blinds people to the consequences of their actions, making them forget that the very individuals they dismiss as dead weight are usually the foundation holding their entire world together. Ultimately, respect cannot be bought or stolen. It must be earned, and those who trade loyalty for wealth will invariably find themselves bankrupt in both. If you believe that a lifetime of hard work and loyalty should be met with respect rather than betrayal, hit the subscribe button and share your own stories of reclaiming your dignity in the comments below.